Search the scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospels, for in them we find him.
Christos Anesti. Welcome, dear brothers and sisters, to Search the Scriptures Live, where we interpret the Bible according to the mind and the writings of the early church. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and today is May 19th, 2025. This is lesson 116 on the Gospel of Matthew. And if you wish to join us live tonight with your questions and your comments, you can do so by calling us at 855-237-2346, 855-237-AF Radio. Or actually, it's just 855 AF Radio. So there you go. We're going to be talking about the tomb of Christ tonight, what we actually know about it historically, archaeologically. This is in connection with our discussion about the burial of Christ in our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We're wrapping up that burial, but we're going to be talking about the tomb because there are archaeological discoveries that are ongoing around the tomb, and we have a lot of information that is kind of interesting and lots of questions that people still raise about how do we know that that's the actual place where Christ was buried. But before we get into that, let's begin with our prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father, who is from everlasting, and thine all holy and good, and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. So, about the burial of Christ, and especially the tomb of Christ, which is our focus tonight, we have relatively few details about the location of the tomb, other than the fact that it was going to be somewhere close to the place of execution because they had to bury him in a hurry, bury the Lord in a hurry, because he died on Friday afternoon. Friday evening marks the beginning of the Sabbath, Friday at sunset specifically, and it was a high Sabbath because it was also the beginning of Passover. So there were a lot of things that had to be done in a short period of time, and there's one particular site that has been venerated by pilgrims literally since that time. And this is the place where today it is located. The tomb is enveloped or encompassed in this gigantic church called popularly the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In the Orthodox world, it's actually called the Church of the Resurrection because our churches are named for saints or for feast days, not for places like tombs, So it's really the Church of the Resurrection for the Orthodox. For some reason, I don't know how it came to be called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but that is the traditional place of the burial of Christ. So we're going to talk about that location and what arguments are made against it and what arguments are made for it. And I think it's important that we discuss these things. So let's begin with Matthew chapter 27 and what he tells us about Jesus's burial. When it was evening, there was a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Or we should say begged. It was a stronger word than just asked. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and departed. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the sepulchre. So we're going to end this evening, by the way, with a couple of really beautiful patristic statements about Joseph of Arimathea, who we know almost nothing about. We talked about him a little bit last time, but I have these beautiful patristic statements that I think are very inspiring when we think about the person of Joseph. So we do have these details about the burial of Christ. It's very little, but when you think about it, there's not a lot of detail about most things in the Gospels. And I don't know if there would ever be enough detail, because it seems that we always want to know more. But this was sufficient to say in a very conclusive manner that the Lord actually died. You see, that he died and that he was buried in a Jewish manner. So, of course, we've already discussed this. I'm not going to get into details with you about this, but one of the arguments made against the resurrection is that Jesus was never buried because the Romans did not allow crucified criminals to be buried. We discussed that already. That was only the case in certain types of crimes. And in the case of Jews, even Jews who were accused of treason, like Jesus was, they were allowed to be buried. As a matter of fact, it was one of the rights that Jews had in the empire to give their dead a burial, and it was required by Jewish law. They were very, very serious about that. So this is one of the things that we hear and that we can dismiss. This is what the reason why it's there is to tell you that Jesus actually died and he was actually buried, because they're going to go ahead. Matthew is going to go ahead and talk about the resurrection. So first, of course, before we can say that somebody rose, we have to say that he died. We have to prove that he died. And that means that you have to deal with the body in the way that would be expected by the culture and the people living in that place at that time. So he was given a proper burial. And even if he wasn't highly regarded, the law of Moses demanded, absolutely required, that a person who died by crucifixion or other kinds of hanging, that was what crucifixion was considered, had to be buried. And that was in the law of Moses, going back to the time of Moses. That's in Deuteronomy. So that's one of the first 5 books. It's the 5th book in the Bible. So this is a very old law. It was also claimed that he would never be buried in a tomb because, it would defile the tomb to have the body of a criminal. And of course, this is a brand new tomb, and obviously Joseph doesn't think of him as a criminal. And instead, he gave Jesus a tremendous honor. And in the end, it was the Lord who honored him by this. But there's another thing that is often said, and one of the reasons why we're talking about some of the details concerning the tomb is that the fact that people will say, well, Jesus just, fainted, he passed out, he was in a coma, he didn't really die. And when he woke up inside the tomb, he just pushed the stone and he got out. Well, that's absolutely impossible. The stone weighed many tons. So we're going to be talking here about some of the details regarding the tomb so that we can better understand what happened and the reality of the resurrection. These details, which they're not just technical details or historical facts we're trying to get an answer to, but also to verify the resurrection, because nobody could get out of a tomb by themselves. They couldn't possibly move the stone, particularly if they had been crucified, and lost all that blood and the rest. But it also speaks to the reality of the resurrection and the fact that there were guards that were placed outside of the tomb. I don't think we're going to end up being able to talk about the guards today, why they were requested, and what it meant that they were there, and the fact that Jesus rose anyhow, in spite of their presence. Nobody could account for the disappearance of the body, but we'll get to that probably next time. So what do we know about the tomb? And since it's such an important site, you may argue the single most important site, I think that actually can't be argued, the most important site in the history of the Christian faith, the most important site of pilgrimage inside the Church of the Resurrection is the Lord's burial place. And let's begin by talking about what the tomb would have been like, because if you go there today to Jerusalem to venerate the tomb of Christ, it's not going to look anything like the way it actually looked in that time. And that's a little bit confusing to people. And some people find it kind of off-putting. They think that the church, having been built around the tomb, maybe spoiled it because it doesn't have the real feeling like it would have. But there's no way that the tomb would have been left in its natural state, because it's normal for Christians to beautify things. That's just what we do at the churches. We don't have plain churches. We've never had plain churches. Even from the beginning of the church, if you think about catacombs where Christians were buried are decorated with scenes, painted scenes. Sometimes it's a picture of a saint. It might be Jonah coming out of the whale. It might be, the Last Supper. It might be the Virgin Mary and Christ child. But there's something that seems very inherent in the Christian spirit to try to decorate a place, to beautify the place. And all of this is done not for us, not to show off how nicely we can make something, but for the glory of God. So there's this kind of idea, especially among many Protestants, that churches should be plain. But we decorate our churches because we are using it to glorify God. And that's very, very Jewish. The Jewish temple was elaborately decorated with the most costly materials. And synagogues were also beautifully decorated. And old synagogues have been discovered dating back to soon after the time of Christ, second century, third century, that were very elaborately decorated with scenes from the Bible. So don't think that this is not something that Jews didn't do also. So the Christians followed in that practice to decorate and beautify whatever spaces they had. Now, they didn't have any churches, not in the beginning, because Christianity was illegal and they were being persecuted. So they were meeting in houses. But once Christianity is legalized by Constantine the Great, he starts to build a lot of churches. And then not just him, other people built churches too. But one of the churches he's responsible for is the church for the Holy Sepulchre, church for the tomb of Christ. So let's begin by talking about the tombs in general in the first century Judea. Families with money and status had large tombs outside the city. Now, if you were to go to Jerusalem today, this church is inside the city walls. And that's because after the time of Christ, not too much later, but just a couple of decades later, the city limits of Jerusalem were enlarged. So they took more of the outside land and they enclosed it because they didn't have enough space. And when we're talking about moving the wall and enclosing, because the entire city is surrounded by a wall. So they moved the wall and they took some of the land that previously had been outside of the city, a place where there would have been a cemetery, also a place of execution, because executions also took place outside of the city. And so they enclosed that area. So today, if you enter Jerusalem, you're going to find the church inside the city walls. But at the time of Christ, the tomb was outside because they didn't bury people inside the city. So wealthy people had these large tombs, and they were very elaborately decorated with beautiful facades. Sometimes they had a little courtyard. They had greenery. They would have a bench outside for people to sit. And one of the reasons perhaps why they had these tombs that were more like a cave inside is because of the limestone that's pervasive in this area. And limestone is a very soft rock. It's easy to identify a hillside, and if it's made of limestone, to remove the dirt and then cut a cave to create your own cave on the inside. And so this is how they would make these tombs. They were cut into a hill, and it was easy to do it because they're not cutting granite or marble or something. They're just cutting into limestone. Now, the entrance to the tomb would have been very short, very small, and low. You had to bend over to enter. And one reason is because they wanted to close the entrance. They didn't have a way to secure it the way we would have today. And so the best way that they had to secure it was to put a very large stone in front of it. And we're going to be discussing what kind of stone that would have been. But you had to bend over to get in, like you're entering a little small space. But once inside, it had a larger ceiling. It was sunken down, and it was big enough so that you could stand up, tall enough, I should say, on the inside so that you could stand up inside. You would want to be able to stand up because you were bringing the body in. You might later have to tend to the bones of the person or bring in another body, or people. So people would go in, entering the tomb would be able to stand up because the the floor of the tomb was dug out so that it was sunken. You took a couple steps down, and then you entered the tomb, and you were able to stand up on the inside. So these tombs, family tombs, such as the type that Joseph of Arimathea had for the Lord, had given or over for the burial of the Lord, were designed to hold the remains of multiple people. They were a family tomb, not like a mausoleum for one person. And they would have like dug into the rock would be shelves. There could also be a kind of a platform, sort of like a table, where you could also put a body. But there were also these shelves that were carved out of the rock, more like a long niche where you could place the body, or also smaller niches which would hold an ossuary. An ossuary was a box, a stone box with a lid, stone receptacle container with a lid. And that's where you would put the bones of the person after the body had completely dissolved. You would put it inside of an ossuary, and they would inscribe the name of the person, sometimes who their parents were, depending upon where you were, how old they were when they died, maybe a profession or something like this. There are thousands and thousands of ossuaries. If you go to any museum with antiquities, you're going to see lots of ossuaries. So, of course, the bones have been removed out of respect for the deceased, but these were just very, very, very common because they didn't just bury the person in the ground and leave them there. They would reuse the space where that body had been placed. After so many years, they would go and collect the bones. They would put them into an ossuary, into this box with the bones, and then they would put it on a shelf. And so there were lots of spaces for ossuaries, for lots of relatives. The tomb was used and reused. And that seems very, very strange, especially to people in a Western culture. But this is done in Greece today. They bury a person, and then after several years, the body is exhumed, and the bones are washed, and prayers are said, and they're put into a box. The bones are put into a box. This is what is done. And so this is one way that we have discovered saints who have not dissolved. They have not, the body is intact. Okay. So this is one of the only way that we can find it in America, since we don't exhume bodies. That doesn't usually happen. Then there's no way to know that the person was a saint in that way. That's like a sure sign that the person was a saint. It's either that they were a saint or they were a great sinner. It's one or the other, but you could tell the difference because a beautiful fragrance would come out of the tomb if the person's body was still intact because they were a saint. So the family would gather at so many years later. They would remove the bones of the person, place it in an ossuary, label it, or have somebody inscribe it. They would have to, chisel into the stone, say who it was. And one of the things that's useful, very, very useful, these inscriptions on ossuaries and other kinds of tombs, among the most common inscriptions throughout the ancient world are inscriptions on tombs. And they're actually very helpful in a lot of ways. It's one of the ways that they sort of figure out how long people lived, how people died, what were common names, which kinds of names were uncommon. So when we say, and other kinds of little details, historical details, you can kind of figure out or get just tidbits of historical information, sometimes from the statements on these ossuaries, on other tombs. Sometimes they'll have other, little comments. So anyhow, so these cave-like tombs were protected from animals because you didn't want animals to go in and eat the body, by these large stones that were used to block the entrance. Now, in other cultures where they might bury people with a lot of valuables, that might also be a consideration. I think that the Jews didn't really have that practice of burying people with a lot of expensive items. They didn't have this idea that you're going to need these objects in the next life. There are some objects that are found in tombs, but they don't usually seem to be suggesting a belief that the dead person is going to need those objects. They'll find glass vials, they will find oil lamps, but that's because they're using it to light up the inside of the tomb. They're using the glass vials, they might have had myrrh in them or some other aromatic substance because of the stench inside the tomb. So I don't think that it was done primarily against grave robbers, although that did happen sometimes. And of course, that's what Mary Magdalene is worried about when she finds the tomb empty on Pascha morning, on Easter morning. At any rate, you had to close a tomb, and you had to close it by using a very large round rock shaped like a coin, a thick coin. And this is what people have always presumed was the rock that was used to enclose the tomb for Christ. And then in order to move it, there was a channel or a deep groove that held it in place. And people would roll it back and forth in that channel. And this is why, but it was massively heavy. You needed more than one man to move it. And this is one of the concerns of the myrrh bearers when they say, who will roll away the stone from the tomb for us? Because they couldn't do that. And there was more than one of them. They needed several men. So it was very, very heavy. My point is that a crucified person who happened to survive crucifixion, which is basically impossible anyhow, because the Romans didn't let somebody down until they knew that he was dead. But let's just say theoretically it was possible. They couldn't have exited the tomb by themselves. They would have been stuck in there. They would have probably died inside the tomb if they were entombed by mistake. So of course that's an impossibility. Now, today I was reading an article in the Biblical Archaeology Review that was published only about 2 months ago, and they were discussing what the stone was like that blocked the entrance to Jesus's tomb. Because of course it says the stone was rolled away, and who will roll away, the word there that is used is the word roll. And this is why we are picturing this coin-shaped or sort of a disc-shaped, very large stone. Later, by the way, in the centuries after Christ, a little bit later, maybe a couple hundred years later, they started to use smaller stones that were also disc-shaped. And so that meant that the entrance had to be even lower, but the stone could be a bit lighter because it didn't have to block the whole entrance. Now, this person who was writing the article was saying that Jesus's tomb did not have a disc shape or round stone, but something that was more like a stopper, more like a cork. Now, don't think of a cork from like a bottle of wine, but she means something that was flat, sort of like a small, like a shape of a box, but on the end of it, it had a stopper that would protrude into the tomb. It would still be massive and extremely heavy. Now, does this matter whether or not it was a cork-like or a stopper-like enclosure, or that it was more like a coin? It doesn't really matter, but these are the kinds of questions that Bible scholars discuss and wrestle with and ask about, and want to know these little details, even though it's not ultimately of great importance. But they do, when we can identify something that we think is a true detail, it sometimes tells us something about, it gives us a clue about something else. So it's not an important question, but I wanted to talk about it to explain to you how people arrive at different conclusions with the same information, because this is still an issue. You'll read something and a person seem like they know what they're talking about. They're an expert, but they reach a particular conclusion, and you, not knowing differently, say, wow, they're the expert. I guess they know. And so you kind of accept their conclusion because it seems to make sense. So we have to be very careful about this, because people draw conclusions from the same information, but they can draw very diametrically opposed conclusions, because your conclusion often depends upon the premises that you began with, the assumptions that you had when you applied that information that you learned. For example, because I heard from somebody today very recently who told me that he was a very devout Christian, involved in his church, did other kinds of ministries and things like this. And he read this, he was started to have doubts about the Bible. He read these books by Bart Ehrman, who's a very famous so-called Bible scholar, but he doesn't believe. He was a believer at one time, now he doesn't believe. So he writes books that really destroy people's faith. And this poor fellow who wrote to me had lost his faith. He'd become an atheist. And something recently has been changing his mind. Now, the point here is Bart Ehrman is working with the same kind of information about manuscripts in the Bible that every other Bible scholar is working with. But we don't arrive at the same conclusions that he does because he's also ignoring other information. He's ignoring other facts, and he's presenting the facts in a way that is designed to lead you to the conclusion that he wants you to have. That is, that the Bible is fake, that it can't be relied on for historical purposes. So that's why I'm going to go through this little exercise with you to sort of help you to understand how the difference in your premise and your assumptions makes you arrive at a totally different result. And it's important for us to do this so that we can understand to be very careful before we accept the conclusion of somebody that seems to go against what the church has always taught. And the church has been around for a very long time, a lot longer than these folks who claim that they know better. So I'm going to explain this to you and how she arrived at this conclusion and why I would arrive at a very different conclusion. So I think we should take a break right here, and you can join me after the break.
The crucifixion and resurrection of Christ are central events in our salvation. Yet few Christians have a good grasp of the first-century historical and religious context in which the crucifixion took place, nor of its true significance for the people of that time, and hence for our time as well. In her book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, biblical scholar Dr. Jeannie Constantinou puts modern readers in the center of the events of Christ's Passion, bringing the best of modern scholarship to bear while keeping her interpretation faithful in every particular to the early church tradition. If you love Search the Scriptures live on Ancient Faith Radio, you'll also love The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, available now at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
Okay, so we have, first of all, a question came in on YouTube from Jackie. Why would a sinner's body not decompose? Well, all of us are sinners, and our bodies do decompose. So this would be a very extreme case. I've not heard a lot about this, but I have heard about it a little bit. So I'm not a person to speak about this with any kind of expertise, but particularly a person who is possessed, their body might not decompose, but there'd be an obvious difference between them and a saint. A saint would exude their body a beautiful aroma, and they would be at peace, whereas a person who had died in a very, very bad spiritual state would stink, and the body would still be there. And so but it would stink and it would be distorted in some manner. This is what I was told a very long time ago. So, and I wish I had more information to share with you, but I don't. Speaking about how people draw conclusions, last week we were talking a bit about the shroud, and I told you I'm not certain about it, but it seems to me it's more likely to be genuine because nobody can explain how the image was made. And also, but over the weekend, I was driving and I was listening to somebody's podcast or some kind of a lecture, and I don't even know who it was. It was an Orthodox Christian, and he was disparaging the shroud because he was talking about how St. John's Gospel speaks about the orthonia, strips of cloth that were placed upon the body of Jesus. That's what John has. He doesn't mention a shroud. And so this person was saying, oh, it's ridiculous that this fake shroud is, being venerated. And this is an Orthodox Christian talking. Nowhere does it mention anything about a shroud. And it does, actually. I thought that's a pretty big mistake for you to make there, buddy, to just assume. Now, John's gospel doesn't, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke do mention a shroud, and they don't have the orthonia. So we have a little bit of a discrepancy there between the words that are used. But you can't say that the Bible doesn't mention a shroud. It most certainly does in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So how that worked in with the orthonia, the strips of cloth, I don't know. But you can't say that this is a totally, this is a forgery because the Bible doesn't mention it. And I thought that was a very big mistake. And so we have to be careful. Obviously, we all must make mistakes. I may make mistakes, but also as well. But let's be careful about that. Anyhow, so let us take a look again. What it says, Joseph took the body, wrapped it, here it is, in a clean linen shroud, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and departed. Now, just a couple of months ago, in March of 2025, there was this article by Megan Sauter about how was Jesus's tomb sealed in the Biblical Archaeology Review. Now, this part was kind of interesting. More than 900 Second Temple period burial caves around Jerusalem have been examined by this one particular archaeologist, Amos Kloner. Now, so that's a lot of tombs. Second Temple Judaism. Now, Second Temple Judaism is from about 510 or 520, whenever they started rebuilding the Second Temple, to the year 70 AD. So it covers more than 500 years, almost 600 years of history. But that's a period of time in which Jesus lived. We call that Second Temple Judaism. It's got a very different character in a lot of ways than the Judaism that was more archaic. We don't even call that Judaism. The Hebrew religion of somebody like Abraham or Moses or David was much more primitive than in Second Temple Jerusalem. But this archaeologist, Amos Kloner, has done work on 900 tombs. That's a lot of tombs. And only 4 have had the disc-shaped blocking stones. This is what she says. And that these 4 were among the wealthiest tombs. So the question is, would Jesus's tomb have this disc-shaped or coin-shaped stone that was literally rolled across the entrance like this, like a coin rolling on its edge? Or would it have been one of these stopper kinds, like a big square stopper that you plugged into the tomb to block the edge, the entrance, the way you would stop up a bottle of wine with a cork? So she concluded that it had to be this cork type, not the rolling stone type. And because it says in the Bible that it was rolled, that Joseph rolled away the stone from the tomb and closed the tomb, the archaeologist that she was talking about, Amos Kloner, decided that the word roll here, which was proskilio, could also mean dislodge or lodge it, put it into place, or to remove it in the sense of dislodge. So this author said she did a lot of study. She looked into the Greek, and she said that this word can never mean anything other than roll. And she's right. And I looked into it also. So the word here that's used, the word is kilio, which is to roll. It's proskilio, which means pros means I roll toward something, roll to something, toward in a certain direction. So that's the word that's used here for Joseph's movement of rolling the stone toward the entrance, to close the entrance. So the root word is kilio, and that root is related to the word kyklos, which means circle in Greek, or even Kima, which is the word for wave. And by the way, those are still the words in modern Greek for those things. Kima is a wave, kyklo is a circle. The point is that this word suggests circularity. In other words, this word can only mean roll. Now, here was the interesting part of it. She still decided that Jesus's tomb was covered by this stopper type of rock, even though it says roll here. Why did she come to that conclusion? She's right that this word can never mean that he moved the stone or just dislodged the stone. It has to mean roll. And she just decided, well, they must have had to roll it somehow to put it in place. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But she began with the premise that it was a cork, not a disc. And why is that? Why is that? Because she said this fellow looked at all these tombs, and all but 4 that he examined, and there must have been some that he hadn't examined, all but 4 of them did not have a coin type of slot that showed that it was a disc type of closure. Okay, so the point is that because of the evidence, in other words, the sheer number of tombs, the only ones that had the coin were among the wealthiest, the tombs from the wealthiest types of families. Now, why can't it be that Joseph was very wealthy? Because we know he was wealthy, right? That's what the Bible says. My point is that why doesn't that tell us the fact that it says that the stone was rolled, rather than deciding that they must have had a way to roll these other types of stones or tumble these other types of stones? Why doesn't that suggest something about the person of Joseph? Maybe he's wealthier than we might have ordinarily known. Maybe that's what that is suggesting. The point is that there is another possible conclusion, but her assumption was that Jesus's tomb was ordinary. How do you know that? Maybe the fact that it mentions the rolling suggests that it was not an ordinary tomb. Maybe it was a very expensive tomb. Why not? Because, sometimes people, either Joseph was very expensive, very wealthy, or maybe he really wanted a very nice tomb for his family and decided to splurge. People do that, At the cemetery where some of my relatives are buried, they have little areas that are kind of cordoned off. They have a little gate. There's a low wall, a low sort of a fence, pretty fences around them, a little gate. You walk into this particular area that has the name of the family, and all the people are buried in this little area. And my brother and I were looking at saying that's very nice, isn't it? We have a sort of a little family area. And so we said, why don't we find out what it would cost to do that for our family? This was like 15 years ago. So we asked the cemetery, they said $60,000. And we said, this is too much. No, we can't afford that. Okay. But there are people that want that. How do we know that this is not Joseph of Arimathea's desire to have a very nice tomb? But notice that she presumes that Jesus's tomb was ordinary. How do we know that? I'll give you another example of this. People who say that Jesus must have been married. Why? I asked them why, on what basis? There's zero evidence that Jesus was married. And the evidence in the case of the tomb is that this was a coin covering, not a squarish kind of covering, because it uses the word roll. Why isn't that taken into consideration? There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that Jesus was married. Okay, well, they say, well, most people were in those days. Almost everybody got married. That's true. Almost everybody got married. But just because almost everybody got married doesn't mean that Jesus was married. Okay, the same thing with this. Just because almost everybody had this type of an enclosure, a rock to close their tomb, doesn't mean that that was the case in the case of Christ. So people have a proclivity to come to certain conclusions and then use whatever details that they can find in the scriptures, and we all do this to a certain extent, to support their conclusion, but we're not supposed to do that. So since it says rolled, I'm going to assume that it was actually rolled, okay? I don't think it proves anything. Not that it's important, but I do want you to be thinking about that when you think about the details, or you read something that somebody says and they've drawn conclusions. It has to be this because da. Remember that there are always details that they are omitting, or that they are skewing the results of their investigation, or they're skewing the results of their their findings or the information that they have in order to draw a certain conclusion, especially in the case of the Bible, anything having to do with religion. That happens quite a bit. So Joseph of Arimathea must have been a very extraordinary person, and he may have been much wealthier. All it says is that he was rich. How rich? Well, maybe richer than we thought. We don't know. At any rate, let's talk about the fact that there are other tombs that people say Jesus could have been buried in. And this is something else that I think is quite important to discuss. A few years ago, there was a big hullabaloo about the so-called family tomb of Jesus. And they made a film about it. It was on the television, on the Discovery Channel. And they said, the family tomb of Jesus has been discovered, and Jesus is listed in there also among the deceased, and his bones are there, and the rest of this sort of nonsense. This came to be called the Talpiot family tomb. And this was about 5 kilometers outside of the old city of Jerusalem. It was discovered in 1980, but there was a kind of a rediscovery, or was sort of reinterpreted in 2007 with this documentary about the lost tomb of Jesus that was produced by James Cameron, no less, the guy who brought us the Titanic, right? Movie, and also a biblical scholar named Simcha Jacovici. All right. Now, they found this tomb, and then they, of course, remember, especially around Easter time, around Lent, people are always wanting something sensational. This is when the magazines are in the supermarket with some kind of a cover about Jesus, the lost gospels, or secrets about this or that, or what really happened here or there, or just something pretty with nice pictures about Jesus. This is when you find them. They want to attract viewers, and so they want to give a sensationalist picture of what happened, or maybe they're really trying to find out the truth, but they don't know anything about what they're talking about. I'll give you another example of this. This was when I was watching some program about the fire of Rome. The fire of Rome. Now, all of the historical evidence, at least of the time, the Roman historians said that Nero set this fire that broke out in the year 64 in July and burnt 2/3 of the city of Rome to the ground. The Romans said that Nero was responsible for the fire. Not that he started it personally, but he somehow got it started. It's either that, or maybe it was just a terrible accident. That could happen too in July in southern Italy. Okay, it could be very hot, and there could have just been this catastrophic fire. So we don't really know whether or not Nero was to blame. But Nero, knowing that people wanted to blame him for the fire, he decided to blame the Christians. This was the first Roman persecution of Christians. Romans were not persecuting the Christians or harassing the Christians in any way prior to this. Contrary to what you see on TV, where the Romans and the Jewish leaders are trying to stop the church, that didn't happen. Okay, that's something else that's just totally fictional. So Nero tries to blame the Christians. So the whole point of this so-called documentary or program about the fire was that Christians maybe really did start the fire. And they started talking about the apocalypse and how it says the world's going to end with fire, which it doesn't even say that in the apocalypse. But, they try to make this case that people didn't even believe who lived through the fire. The Christians were not responsible for the fire, but they try to sensationalize it and dramatize it. And that was their conclusion, because they know absolutely nothing. And they wanted people to watch their show. So you're familiar with this too on YouTube, right? They put these sort of sensational or outlandish titles on these little clips to get you to click on it, because they make money when you click, right? So I don't do that. So I don't end up with as many clicks as some people, but I'm not here to get you to click just so that I can make money, because I'm not making money off of this. Do you see my point? So you have to be skeptical. We have to really develop a much healthier skepticism when people make these outrageous claims. So let's talk about, this Talpiot tomb is absolutely, here's why they said it was a family tomb of Jesus. Because inside the tomb, they found some of these ossuaries, the stone box with bones inside. And inside, and they have the names of the person whose bones they were. And they said they had certain names. And the names were Yeshua, which is Jesus, and Mary, Mariam, and there was one for Joseph. So they said, oh, this got to be the tomb of Jesus. What's the chance? What's the chances of that these three names would be found in this tomb, along with like 12 other names of 12 other people? So this, on that basis, somebody said, oh, we found the family tomb of Jesus. Well, of course, these were very common names. I mean, the name Mary, are you kidding me? We got Mary, the sister of Martha. We have Mary, the mother of Jesus. We got Mary Magdalene. We have Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. And there's like a zillion Marys in the Bible. So these were very common names. We have two disciples named Simon. We have two disciples named of the 12 named James. So people had a lot of the same names. That people weren't interested in giving their kids unique names the way parents are today. They gave them traditional names. So this was absolutely unfounded. Okay, not to mention the fact that it would have been too far away for the burial of Jesus. That's for sure, because he had to be buried in a hurry. But also, it wouldn't explain why Jesus' family would have a tomb in Jerusalem when really they're from Galilee, and a tomb that was hewn out of a hillside was expensive. Jesus came from a poor family, so that makes no sense. But they got people to watch the show, and it died down. But what I'm trying to get across to you, all of this excitement about this, or this big hullabaloo, is it undermines faith. And you know the truth about this. I don't think we should support these things by watching them, even out of curiosity, because it simply undermines people's faith. And they wonder, what, man, you never know. Maybe Jesus never really did rise. Here's the actual family tomb. It looks pretty. The evidence is pretty overwhelming. No, it's not. It's very underwhelming. It's nothing. It makes no sense. Now, nobody stops to think. They just know, oh yeah, there was this Jesus, his mom was Mary, and she was married to Joseph. So that seems to make sense that this could be their tomb. Well, that's because in families, in a lot of families, and in this culture, in the American culture, for example, if one person has a name, nobody else in the family ends up with that name usually, okay? So-and-so named their kid this. Oh, nobody else can name their kid the same thing, because they want it to be unique. Not in Greek families, that's for sure. And a lot of other traditional cultures where you have a whole bunch of people within the relatives with the same name. Okay, that's just how it is. And so because you find a tomb and three of the names are Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, that doesn't mean that this is a family tomb of Jesus, but a person who doesn't know better might be convinced by this. So hopefully you know better, or at least you're going to be very skeptical. And then you can call up this show, or you can call up Father Evan Armitage on Sunday nights and ask him about it, okay? Because don't be gullible, all right? You have to be very skeptical when you're getting your historical information, especially not from a television show. Oh, I have to share something else with you. I don't remember if I told you this, but during Lent, I said to Father, I heard that this movie is on the Last Supper, and that was part of this, the Chosen series. The people who make this TV show, The Chosen. Now, we haven't been watching it. A lot of people really like it. And I haven't been watching it. We find it moves very slowly. It can't hold our interest. And I just find it too difficult to watch because of the many, many historical mistakes that they make on that show. So we went to see it, though, because we're not going to go to the movies during Lent. But for this, we might go because I thought it might be nice to see a religious movie. So it was very long, and it was okay, but there just were so many mistakes, and it was just it was unnecessary to make some of the mistakes that they made. I kind of understand, especially when they're supposed to have technical advisors. First of all, one of the mistakes that they made, we're getting off topic here, but I know now you want to know what mistakes is, I'm just going to mention one of the most glaring ones anybody should have noticed, is that Judas goes to Caiaphas to try to get 30 pieces of silver, or to get money for Jesus. Judas goes to Caiaphas. It doesn't say that in the Bible. Never says that he met Caiaphas. He went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me?" In this case, he doesn't even say that. They're not really following the Bible as much as they want you to think. That's one thing. But they show the Last Supper. And the Last Supper, they have Mark, who was a nephew of Peter, according to church tradition. He's somehow related to Peter, a male relative of Peter, and Peter the 12th, the Peter, Simon Peter. And he would have known Jesus, okay? But in the movie, of course, they don't know anything about that. He has some kind of a dream. He needs to set the table for Passover or something like this. And, okay, fine, maybe he never met Jesus before that. Okay, I'll maybe accept that. But he sets a table. Let me tell you what it was. He made this U-shaped table with the front of the table with Jesus and John on one side and Judas on the other side. We know that John was on one side. I don't know about Judas being on the other side. Probably not. But then two long arms. All the rest of the disciples were in the other places. Now, he had tablecloths and like candelabras with, candles in them, and individual place settings with napkins and plates and things, the way you would set a table today. They did not do that. Forget about the fact that if maybe you don't want to believe that they were reclining. That's what it says in the Bible. They were reclining. That's how they used to eat the Passover in the time of Christ. But let's say they were sitting at a table the way Leonardo da Vinci imagined it. They didn't have individual place settings. People reclined around a common plate. Everybody literally ate out of the same plate. Okay? So, it made for a pretty picture when they showed Jesus around the table talking to the disciples, giving them these other instructions before his crucifixion. I'm laughing because he begins to get kind of emotional, and they ask him, "Rabbi, why are you getting emotional?" And he says to them, "I need a moment." And he gets up and he goes outside. And it's just so modern. Okay, it's just so modern. Now, there's nothing terribly wrong with watching these things, except what it does is it imprints in your brain, in your memory, an idea about what happened that isn't true. Because we are very visual people. So when we see something, we tend to remember it. You at least incorporate it into what you read. Because most of you are not reading your Bible every day, but you're watching these things every day. And maybe you read your Bible some of the time, or you're hearing the Bible in church. Maybe for the Last Supper, it's once a year, at Holy Week, because we don't read it all the time. So you're forming in your own head ideas about what happened that are not accurate. They're not even biblical. And that's the danger in it. So it would be much better if you read your Bible. Okay, that would be much better. And try to keep these ideas out of your head. So the first tomb, which people say might be the tomb of Christ, and nobody believes, there's only one scholar believes that is a genuine tomb of Jesus. Nobody believes it, this Talpiot tomb. The other one, which is very popular with Protestants, is the so-called Garden Tomb. This was discovered by this fellow named Charles Gordon in 1883, or maybe he popularized it. And he said, this is the real tomb of Jesus because it's not in a church and it's kind of in this more of a rural area, but it's really too far away from Jerusalem, from the old city, to have been the tomb of Jesus. He looked at a nearby hill and said, "This is the skull." So Jesus must have looked like a skull, he said. Jesus was crucified here and they buried him here. And this became very, very popular with tourists. I've never been there, but I remember I did go to Jerusalem when I met some people. We had gone to the church, the real church, Church of the Resurrection. I said, "Where did you go?" I met this tourist, and she said, "We went to the real tomb." So she was a Protestant. Okay, there's no way that nobody believes that's the real tomb of Jesus, even Bible scholars. Everybody knows. Protestants, ordinary people kind of like it, but it was not a new tomb. It certainly doesn't, not only logistically is too far away, but it was just much too old to have been Jesus's tomb. It was dug out during the 7th or 8th century BC. So it was several hundred years old, even before the time of Christ. So there's no way that was the tomb of Jesus, because no way that nobody was ever buried in it. And remember, this was a brand new tomb. That's what it tells us in the Bible. So that brings us to the Church of the Resurrection, also known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this is the site with the oldest and continuous attestation as being the actual place of burial of Jesus Christ. And we know that this particular church was built by Constantine the Great, by the order of Constantine the Great, in the life of Constantine. Eusebius of Caesarea, his biographer, who also wrote the history of the church, describes how he ordered the removal of a pagan temple that had been placed there by Hadrian. And I want to talk to you about that. So in the meantime, archaeological research has also discovered that this was a Jewish cemetery in the time of Christ. And there has been recently a lot of archaeological study of the area inside and outside, or rather underneath the edicule. And the edicule is like a little building that contains the tomb of Christ, and it has a dome on top. It's inside the much larger church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the Church of the Resurrection. And this contains the tomb of Christ. So what happened was, when Constantine finally built the church for Christ, that's not the church that's standing there now, that was built later. But when Constantine built his church, then they removed all the dirt around the hillside, and they isolated the tomb of Christ, and then they built the church around that. Okay, so that's what we have right now. We have the tomb, but the hill is gone. Instead, the tomb of Christ has been enclosed by this little church inside a great big church. That's what it is. Okay, so that had not had any restorations for about 200 years. At some point, some work had been done in it in the 1800s. But the edicule, that's the little structure that houses the actual tomb of Christ, was crumbling. They could literally see pieces falling off of it. And it's made with, marble and different pieces of rock and things like this. So they decided to undergo a series of restorations. And this happened in 2016, 2017. A lot of this was covered. There were articles about it. There was, I think National Geographic had done programs about it. There was a whole article in one of the National Geographic magazines about it. And so they did a lot of testing at that time of the structure itself to find out what they could find out. Because one of the things that had been said is that this site was built during the time of the Crusaders, which is Middle Ages. It did not date back to Constantine. So that was one of the first things that they wanted to know. Was it as recent as the Crusader era, or did it actually go back to the time of Constantine? So let's take a break at this point, and when we return, we will continue to discuss what was discovered in and underneath the tomb of Christ, the edicule in Jerusalem. So join me after the break.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
Okay, so as part of the restorations of the edicule, there was a limestone slab that was placed on top of the tomb of Christ, the place where the body of Christ was put. And there was a sort of a Crusader era cross that was on top of that. And this is why they thought that maybe this structure only went back to the tomb to the time of the Crusaders. And they lifted up that limestone slab, and underneath was another slab. And that dated back to the time of Constantine. There was a lot of dust there. But one of the things that's quite amazing, we're really blessed to have great scientists doing this kind of working. They took mortar samples from different locations in the structure, and they confirmed that it dates back to the 4th century, the mid-4th century, and not to the Crusader era. The mortar was dated using a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, OSI, that calculates the last time the quartz sediment was exposed to light. The tests were conducted independently at 2 different labs, and they both affirmed that at least that portion of the tomb that was built by Constantine, that's the original structure of Constantine, that dates back to the time of Constantine. So they say that they can't prove, of course, that Christ was buried there, but that supports all of the historical information that we have about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, what about earlier than that? So the most that scientists can do is get to the 4th century, the time of Constantine the Great. And by the way, Constantine was also the one who ordered that a church be built in Rome over the tomb of St. Peter. And that church, that Constantinian church, is no longer there. Today they have that huge basilica of St. Peter where the Pope is, that was built and designed by Michelangelo. And but underneath, you can go to Rome today, and you have to get on a special tour to get to go under the church to the crypt of St. Peter and see a little bit of his bone. They don't let you look at all of his bones, but you can go down there and see as you're walking underneath the church itself, and you're walking through an ancient Roman cemetery. It's down like 2 stories down. And there you can see the tomb of St. Peter. And they take you, it's a very small spaces there. And that was also very widely attested from the time that Peter was buried there. So Peter was buried there, and everybody knew where his tomb was. And that memory was kept alive throughout, for all the Christians who were living in Rome. And they would visit the tomb, and they would scratch little requests, little prayers to St. Peter on the outside of the tomb, things like this. So this is something, but when Constantine came, he buried all of that because he built the church on top of that. But you can go underneath the church today and to what they call the scavi. I highly recommend it. It's fascinating, but it's also very moving. I was very, very moved to go there and actually be in this room right there where the bones of St. Peter was. It's very amazing. So what about this spot for Christ? How would anybody know that this is the place where Jesus was buried? Fine, Constantine built his church on top of that, just like he built the church on top of St. Peter's grave. How does anybody know that that is where the Lord was buried? And it's very, very simple. And this is, a lot of people are very skeptical, and I'm a skeptic by nature, but I just want you to understand this, that the oral tradition and history about the location of Christ's tomb and other important places was passed on by the people who lived there, and that Christians had been venerating that site since the 1st century. They had gone there and they prayed there. And that was also the case with the tomb of Peter. Now, a few years ago, I went to the island of Patmos, where St. John, the evangelist and apostle, had lived in exile and wrote the book of the Apocalypse. And Father and I were there for several days. It's a very small island, so we really got around. because it's very, very tiny. It's 4 miles long. It's very small. We talked to a lot of people, and people live there, and they know the traditions about St. John and about St. Christodulus, who's the other very important saint of that island, who built the monastery of St. John there on the island 1,000 years ago. A lot of people are named John and they're named Christodulus. It's a very much a part of their tradition. And everybody knows certain places that are associated with St. John on the island. Modern people today, in the 21st century, they'll say, oh yeah, John was baptizing in this place at this river. And they showed it to us, and there's a little church there. And John was baptizing over here, and this is where he had this dispute with this pagan guy. So this is part of the history of the island. Everybody knows it. Anybody who lives there, anybody who grew up there would certainly know it. And I want you to understand that even though we feel like maybe people would not remember that, we're trying to associate that with something in our own lives. So, for example, we had friends who said, oh, this beach is where, my father proposed to my mother. Okay, they would always tell us every time they passed by Zuma Beach in Malibu, they would say, oh, that's where daddy proposed to mommy. Well, they might say to their grandchildren, well, that's where your grandpa proposed to grandma. Maybe they might say, those children, that's where your great-grandpa so-and-so proposed to great-grandma so-and-so. But after that, the memory is going to be lost, because unless you know the people, you have no reason to remember. In the case of Jesus Christ, there's no reason to forget. Nobody would forget. And are you telling me that the people would forget where the Lord was buried? That Christians would say, well, let's see, where was Jesus buried? I'm not quite sure. Are you kidding me? Nobody would forget. People would say, this is where this happened, and this is where this happened. That's why when St. Helen went there later, she was able to identify these places and put churches on all of these holy sites, because Christians remembered. Because it wasn't that they were trying to remember their own family history, which can dissipate in time. This is history about the Lord. And that was passed on by the Christians. And to show you that there's a difference, and what we're talking about, a continuous historical remembrance of Christians living in the same place all of those generations. Father Costa and I visited Ephesus once, and we were asked whether we wanted to go to this place or this other place. And the other place was the so-called House of the Virgin Mary in Ephesus, which is like a tourist attraction. So I said to myself, I don't know if I should go. Could they really know after all these years that this was the House of the Virgin Mary? Well, actually, no. Okay, what I found out is that there was one person, supposedly a Catholic nun. I don't know the whole story. She had a vision that told her that this is the house where Mary lived. Now, I don't know if anybody's done any excavations to see whether or not it really went back to the 1st century. This is where Mary lived in Ephesus with St. John. But based on her dream or her vision or whatever it was, there's a whole industry of people who are visiting the House of Virgin Mary. Can you see how different that is? And that's only like 100 years ago. 100 years ago. And it comes from one person. There's a tremendous difference. I'm 100% skeptical about that. I have no reason to believe that that's genuine. But that Christians were visiting the tomb of Christ. Wouldn't you have gone to the tomb of Christ if you knew where it was in the 1st century, or you had become a Christian? Show me where the resurrection took place, and your friend takes you there. Wouldn't you have gone? Of course you would have gone. Would you have forgotten it? Never. Would you have told all of your children? Absolutely. And all of the other Christians who were illumined after you, you would have taken them, you shown them, you would have talked about all the things that Jesus Christ said and did. And there were many more things that you would have known as a member of the early church than we know today, because most of what happened was not written down. So there was a continuous stream of faithful people who were venerating the tomb of Christ until a very short period of history when they were not allowed to. So I want you to understand that this location was not known by one person or even a handful of people, just the apostles. Remember that Pentecost happens shortly thereafter. 7 weeks after the resurrection is Pentecost. And that day, 3,000 people are baptized. So the church is in Jerusalem, and it grows rapidly in Jerusalem. There are thousands of believers in Jerusalem. Do you think that they knew where the tomb was? Absolutely they did. Do you think they told their children and other believers? Absolutely. So this isn't like a family story. This is where mommy and daddy first met or something. This is a story that was known by thousands and thousands of people back in the first century. And it was not forgotten because there was no reason to forget it. And that was to the contrary, there was every reason to remember it. So here is when the Christians were not allowed to be there. And it was a very short period of time. The first time was when the Jewish-Roman War broke out. The Zealots finally succeeded in starting a war against Rome. They started a revolt, and this is called the Jewish War. And it went on from 66 to 73. The worst part was the year 70, when the temple was destroyed and the city was mostly destroyed. Now, Christians were not part of the war. Christians weren't fighting with the Jews against Rome. So Christians, knowing that the war was going to happen, went to Pella, a different city, and they lived there for several years. After the war, they returned. So now they've returned. Do you think they still know where the tomb is? Have you been to your childhood home, maybe if you haven't been there for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? Of course you know where it is, even if the house isn't there anymore. That's how it is with some of my childhood houses. The house isn't there. Father Costa, every time we go to Toronto, he wants to show us the houses where he lived. One of them is now a McDonald's, but we have to go there because he just likes to reminisce, okay? So he goes to Scarborough and tells us, we lived in this house, we lived in this house, we lived in this house, and our house was here, but now it's a McDonald's, okay? That's how it is. But you don't forget. You see what I'm trying to say? So the church was absent from Jerusalem for that very brief period of time, but they didn't forget where the tomb was, and they continued to venerate it when they returned. Now, things were kind of quiet for about 50 years, and then the Jews decided to revolt against the Romans again around the year 135, and this is called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion, Barkochba, Bar Kokhba, because the fellow who revolted, his name was Simon Bar Kokhba, another Simon, and he said he was the real Messiah, and his real name was Bar Kokhba, but he changed the name to Bar Kokhba, son of the star, because of these messianic imagery. Now, they lost, of course. Rome totally defeated them, crushed them, but the Romans were so so tired of dealing with the Jews revolting against them, because in between the Jewish war and the Bar Kokhba rebellion, there had been a rebellion in Alexandria. So they said, we don't want the Jews to be in this part of the world at all. And they forbade them from living in Palestine. They could not even set foot inside the city of Jerusalem. And this decision, this legislation, was made by Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, and who put down the Bar Kokhba rebellion. He was sick of it. And to make sure that they didn't, they wanted to rebel, they wanted to rebuild their temple that had been destroyed after they rebelled against the Romans. And he said, look, you can't be here anymore. And so to make sure that they stayed away, he built a temple on the Temple Mount, the highest spot in Jerusalem where the temple to the Lord had been. And he called it Aelia Capitolina. Now, that he did, and he also passed a rule that the Jews were not allowed to live in Jerusalem. And that stood for hundreds of years. On one day of the year, they were allowed to come to Judea, to the outskirts of the city, and gaze at the Temple Mount, where the temple had once stood, and mourn the loss of the temple. Chrysostom actually describes that. So he describes them going there. He knows about this, but they still at that time, that's 4th century, were not allowed to live in Jerusalem. So it's very interesting that but it's not just that. Hadrian places a temple, a pagan temple, on the site of the Temple Mount to keep the Jews away, and tells them they can't live there. He did not tell Christians that they could not live in Jerusalem, but Christianity was not legal either. And so he also knew that Christians had their own place where they worshiped and reverenced this person that they worshiped, Jesus, and he built a temple to Aphrodite on the spot of the tomb of Christ. This is mentioned by many ancient Christian writers. And this was done very deliberately. So he didn't forbid, because the Christians never rebelled against Rome, he didn't forbid the Christians from living there, but he wanted to really make a statement and discourage them. He wanted to really blaspheme the site. That's what he wanted to do, because this is Aphrodite we're talking about, the goddess of love, not the goddess of love, the goddess of sex, okay? The goddess of immorality, of every kind of perversion. That's what it was. And so he wanted to really blaspheme the tomb of Christ by putting this temple on top of it. It was a deliberate insult to the Christians, but he did not prevent them from living in the city. Do you think that the Christians forgot where the tomb was? No. In an odd way, they couldn't help but remember it, because Hadrian had done this, had placed this horrible pagan temple dedicated to this immoral goddess on the site of the tomb of Christ. So in an odd way, it actually helped preserve the memory if it had ever been in danger of being forgotten, but I don't think so. So this is mentioned that first Constantine had to remove a temple from that spot, and that's what he did. Okay, so this mattered to the Christians. They never forgot. So there is a continuous Christian presence in the Holy Land from the time of Christ until the time of the Emperor Constantine. They knew exactly where the tomb was. There was no doubt about that. Okay, so that is a very, very strong evidence of the site. But in addition to that, we have some scientific evidence that has recently been uncovered that helps us date it back, that location back to the 1st century. And interestingly enough, it supports some of what was being said by the evangelist John, who called it a garden tomb. This is something that people have had difficulty with because they can't understand why Jesus would be crucified in a spot where there was a garden. Now, when people think of garden, they think of a manicured, maybe very neat place. That's not necessarily what it was. A garden was just a place where there was vegetation. And it's hard for them to imagine that there was vegetation there at the time of Christ. But here's what has recently appeared in another archaeological magazine. And it was a work that was done by a female Italian archaeologist who dug underneath the site of the edicule, the site of the tomb of Christ, underneath the church. Now, you might think that's very strange, but actually, it's very common. There are a lot of archaeological digs going on at any given time underneath the streets and buildings in Jerusalem. You wouldn't know it because you walk into a place, it looks like a store or whatever, but underneath there might be an archaeological excavation going on, because they're not going to tear down the buildings and tear up the streets just to look underneath. They actually have determined a manner of doing archaeology. They have a way of doing it where they're digging underground, and there's people are living in the buildings that are above ground, or they're walking on the streets above ground. So this happens all the time in Jerusalem. So University of Rome professor Francesca, it's not the University of Rome, I think it was there was another name for the university. I didn't copy it right. I remember reading of this, but she's from Rome. Francesca Stasola. She headed this excavation team looking underneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And they found at that level where the original tomb of Christ was, remains of olive trees and grapevines that were 2,000 years old. And they found seeds and pollen that were discovered via archaeobotanical analysis performed on soil samples that had been extracted from beneath the stone floor of the church. This work began in 2022, and it's the most extensive archaeological excavation underneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for almost 200 years. Now they have modern techniques. It's just amazing what they can discover. This was approved by the three religious communities that manage the church: the Orthodox Patriarchate, The Armenians and the Catholics, the Franciscans, are involved in this too. And it was licensed by the Israeli Antiquities Authority. They concluded that the area between Golgotha and the tomb, that's the site of the crucifixion and the tomb, they're very close to each other, a matter of a few yards, a number of yards, but it's within sight of each other right there. It's very close by. It was a cultivated plot of land. That's what John said in his gospel. Matthew doesn't mention it. He doesn't deny it, but he doesn't mention it. Some of the things that they found when they excavated beneath the church were pottery, not surprising, oil lamps, glass, Roman coins, olive trees and grapevines, low stone walls separating garden plots, some of which date back to the Iron Age. All this attests to the widespread human presence and pilgrimage at the site for many years. And of course, the botanical record dates back. That's the most interesting part, that there would be people going there. It's one thing, but that they have this archaeological, botanical expertise that they can date the plants and the pollen back to the time of Christ is quite remarkable, because this confirms that even though today you look at it, it doesn't look anything like a garden, like St. John said, the tomb was located in a garden, meaning plots of cultivated land. That doesn't mean that it wasn't there at the time. So this professor Stassola also said that they found, this was very interesting, a circular marble base beneath the current edicule, that's the structure that has the tomb of Christ, which matches the early depictions of the tomb from the 5th and 6th centuries. That, in other words, they think they found Constantine's original foundation for the tomb of Christ, which was reportedly round. Anyhow, I hope you have found this very interesting. It's just good for us to remember that there are not only historical and archaeological details that verify these things, not that we need them, but it's good to hear them. And I want you to be aware that even though people love to say there's no proof of this and there's no proof of that, actually archaeology, which is getting better and better all the time, they're able to detect things before that they could never see because they're microscopic. Archaeology is consistently confirming the truth of the Bible narratives. That's a fact. Because if the Bible was not true, we would be seeing a lot of archaeological reports disproving things. But instead, year after year, these things come out. There are little details here and there, but they come out every year and they confirm these things. They find things that before we thought was lost. A few years ago, the pool of Siloam was discovered. Nobody knew where that was before. The place where the man born blind was sent and washed his eyes and was able to see. Remember that? We didn't know where that was located, but it was discovered a few years ago. So archaeology is consistently proving the truth of the Bible. Never forget that. You heard it here, and you can take that to the bank if possible. But it's a better bank. It's a spiritual bank. Now, I have two things to read for you, which are really beautiful, about Joseph of Arimathea, and I think you're going to really like it. So the first one is by Blessed Theophylact, who was the Bishop of Ohrid in Bulgaria, and his commentary on Mark. This is what he said about Joseph of Arimathea. Let us also take the body of Jesus through Holy Communion and place it in a tomb hewn out of a rock. That is, place it within a soul which always remembers God and does not forget him. And let that soul be hewn from a rock, that is, from Christ, who is the rock on which we are established. Let us wrap the body of Jesus in the linen, that is, let us receive it white in a pure body. For the body is the linen, and, as it were, the garment of the soul. For we must receive the divine body of the Lord, not only with a pure soul, but also with a pure body. We must wrap it and enfold it within ourselves and not leave it exposed. For this mystery is something veiled and hidden, not something to be exposed. Well, the other one, I think you're going to really love this one, is by Saint Epiphanius, who was a bishop of Salamis on Cyprus in the 4th century. This is from his homily on Great Saturday, homily number 2. And he's talking about Joseph of Arimathea, and he's in such admiration of him. So let's remember and laud Joseph also. Here's Saint Epiphanius. This man Joseph was rich, who was permitted to carry off the priceless pearl. How could Joseph not be rich, who carried off the life of the universe? We obtained the gift of he who was nourishing all, the master of all. Joseph, worthy of praise, with daring and boldness, went before Pilate. Joseph sought Jesus of Nazareth, a dead man, for burial. The body of one condemned, Jesus the Nazarene, Jesus the poor, the homeless, the crucified, the one naked, the one disparaged, the son of a carpenter, the one in bonds, who for us all was suspended upon the cross. Then and there, O Joseph, did you know whom you were given when you asked and received him? Did you know then, when going forth to the cross, whom you were taking down and bearing away? But how then did you accomplish the burial, that of Jesus, the terrifying and awesome body of God? Your desire is worthy of praise, but more praiseworthy is your soul's character and temper. For there and then, did you not shudder, bearing in your arms him whom before the cherubim shudder? I bless your hands, O Joseph, which ministered and touched the members of God's body, the bleeding hands and feet of Jesus. I bless your shoulders, bearing the one who bears all things. I bless your head, brought near to that of Jesus, the head of all. I bless Joseph and Nicodemus, for they became like the cherubim, uplifting and bearing God, and like the seraphim, covering and rendering him honor. Saint Epiphanius of Salamis in Cyprus. Well, we're going to conclude for today. Next week, there's not going to be a live show because it's a holiday here in the United States, Memorial Day, and the people who work at the station, they get a day off. So we're not going to have a show, but we're going to continue talking about the burial because there are things that are very important we haven't talked about yet. That is about these myrrh and aloes and those myrrh bearers. Everybody's curious about those ladies. So we're going to be talking about them and about the substances that they were bringing to the tomb and what it is that Nicodemus would have brought to the tomb. And so we will discuss that. And of course, the guards that were placed at the tomb. So we will be discussing that next time. The next live show will be in 2 weeks. So I hope you join us at that time. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantino. You've been listening to Search the Scriptures Live, and this has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. Christos Anesti. Christ is risen. Now let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word. For our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. Amen. Good night.
Depart in peace according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation